Hey, please welcome to our show, Larry the Duck Dunn.
Thank you, Will. Thanks for having me. Hello, everybody. Great to be here.
I almost feel like I'd be introducing someone in a costume or something. I think in the 1980s it wouldn't have phased me. We had so many characters, like yourself, some on-air personalities that had these fun names. But I don't know, now I feel like, most people go by their names, I think, nowadays, right? Or do they?
Yeah, I mean, at the time, what happened was they used to call me, because Donald the Duck Dunn was the bass player for Booker T and the MGs and the Blues Brothers, the guy that smokes the
Right.
pipe, right? He died a few years ago. And I
Oh,
had a DJ, John DeBello, used to call me Duck Dunn on the air. Never really liked the Duck Dunn thing. But I remembered my good friend Jed the Fish, KROQ, K-Rock in Los Angeles, and I thought that was pretty cool. I mean, people remember nicknames, ratings-wise. So I said to my program director, Dennis Mag, what do you think if I flip it? He goes, go for it. Of course, when I got to Sirius 20 years ago, my anniversary is coming up on May 27th, 20 years. You believe it, on First Wave? I
wow.
said, can I go back to my real name? They said, they don't know you by your real name. They only know you as Larry the Duck or Larry the Duck Dunn.
The Sirius would be getting emails. Why did you get rid of Larry the Duck? We don't like this other guy. He's terrible.
And at the time, it was a ratings thing, but, we don't care about ratings on Sirius XM. Maybe
Right.
they do, but we don't care about the ratings. So
Right. Yes, that right. That's so passe ratings. We're above that. So hey, look, I'm so glad to speak with you because for many reasons, but not the least of which is the fact that the role that you and LIR played in the 1980s, essentially ushering in, breaking in. There's so many bands that you played and broke that, we didn't have that sound before and haven't had a sort of a unique sound like that since. So I know you were an intern at St. John's University. I believe it's the same one that DMC sung about going to, right? In Sucker MCs?
yes, sir.
All right.
Same school, St. John's University. I'm on the board, and I taught there. I taught radio announcing.
So when you were going there, you're interning at LIR. Did you were you studying communications? Was it your goal to be a DJ?
Yeah, it's a great question because my major was communication arts, and at the beginning of my junior year, I always told my students at the time, if intern where you want to work. If you want to work at ESPN, intern at ESPN, right? Get your foot in the door. I always wanted to work. I always wanted to be a DJ at LIR. That was my dream. That's what I wanted to do. So when I asked Dr. Franzetti at St. John's for the internship, he granted it. It was a 6-credit internship. I got an A. And at the end of that, they actually hired me. They put me in the music department, then the programming department. And then eventually I went on the air part-time about 3 weeks after I graduated from St. John's. And then eventually I became the music director and full-time on the air too.
And the youngest on-air staff member, right?
Yes. Yeah, most of the DJs around me were about 10 years older. Bob Wall was 4 days older than me. So technically I was the youngest by 4 days.
So you said you wanted to be on LIR. Now, ultimately, look, the story is in a couple of years, and I want to talk about this, how the format changes. But when you're wanting to be on LIR, what is it playing at the time that attracts you to the station?
Great question. The thing was we were kind of skewing new music and the avant-garde bands from New York, like Talking Heads and the Ramones, Television, Blondie. And yet we were still playing the Grateful Dead, the Allman Brothers. We were skirting into Tom Petty. He was launching as a new artist. The Police launched as a new artist in 78. We even dabbled a little bit with the Sex Pistols, but we were going through, as Dennis would once say, if we're on two skates, ice skates, the skates are starting to go apart. That's exactly what was happening. And something finally had to give. So we actually became what was called the New Music Station. But I was on both sides of the format. So we were playing everything from reggae, jazz, rock, classic rock, progressive rock, yet the new wave elements that we knew later on. And it was just one big mishmash of a lot of stuff, a lot of genres going on at the same time. And finally, because there were 5 radio stations in New York that were considered, a classic rock or a rock-oriented format, we had to make a decision because we were just one of 5. And we had to differentiate ourselves. And that's when we went to the New Music Station. Not the New Wave Station, the New Music Station.
Right.
And then when people say, so what artists did you break? That list is really long, like very long.
Yeah. So and you're talking about Dennis McNamara, the program director at the time. If I recall correctly, I'm just trying to remember from maybe months, years ago, maybe reading about the history of radio in the 1980s, that we had a lot of radio stations were having somewhat of an identity crisis or certainly making transitions because I believe in the 70s, sort of disco was king. Right. And then folks, as they saw disco was waning, they had to find some other way of satisfying listeners and keeping listeners. And so folks, like you're saying, moved to the rock format. I think, check me on that so far. Is that?
Well, two things happened. One, radio stations gravitated more to the rock format, or as 70s disco started to wane, remember the clubs needed another niche. And that's when they went from 70s disco to late 70s, early 80s new wave dance. So a lot of these traditional discos, like for example, on Long Island, you had Uncle Sam's. So during the week, it became Spit. So the weekends were the disco 70s, Uncle Sam's. During the week, alternative 70s, 80s, Spit. Same Metro 700, disco in Franklin Square. 007, they reversed the 700 to make it 007. Reds, Decameron, same concept. So they were trying to figure out how to maximize the clubs during the week and on the weekend. And as the disco scene started to wane, then that's when the new wave side during the week took over the weekend. And that's how the transition happened from a monetary point of view and sociologically too.
Right. So when you say that you go to become the new music station, or you're the new music station, and then you transition, you start getting rid of the rock aspects of it, I suppose. What is this decision there? Is it just strictly to distinguish yourself? And if so, I mean, look, the other stations are playing it safe. They're thinking, look, we feel comfortable that there's an audience for this, but as a business decision, Dennis has to be comfortable that there's going to be enough listeners to stay with you, right? I mean,
yeah. So a couple of things happened. So there were 5 AOR, album-oriented rock stations in New York, right? So you had NEWFM, PLJ, LIR, BAB, and at that time, a commercial-free summer station with APP. So we had to make a business decision. I think Ellen told the story very well in New Wave Dare to be Different, that we had to make a case. Now, we weren't shedding our rock roots, meaning the Cult, the Ramones, or Squeeze, or some of the bands that would be traditional rock bands, I guess is the best way to explain it. But we had to make a business decision on being different. And that's why Dare to be Different became our tagline, because we wanted to separate ourselves from the other radio stations in New York. We wanted to make our own sound, our own niche, but not just the songs, but what happened in between the songs. So, for example, we would actually drop in movie clips in between the songs if it was thematic to the song. We throw in cartoon themes like the Jetsons, the Flintstones, and people would go, where the hell did that come from? You know, or Monty Python, or National Lampoon, or Firesign Theater. So these were the things, even Cheech and Chong at one point too, if it made sense to the song. And what we were doing was we were getting even more creative on the air. So we were hired, 1, for musical knowledge, 2, not for voice as much, but for production knowledge, creativity, and the spirit of having fun and being a little whacked.
Yeah. It's interesting, like the way you describe it, it's sort of prescient in the sense, if you think about how media is today, I mean, you think about TikToks, and I don't know all these things very well, but TikTok or Instagram or whatever, where you can scroll through different content and because of these algorithms, they feed you different little short, 2-3 minute things that are related, and it creates an experience, that the user is able to go, a listener is able to go on. LIR was doing that, 40 years ago. That's pretty,
We were. I think we're a little ahead of our time. It's a shame that the license actually ran out eventually.
Yeah.
The FCC license, yeah.
Right. Was that in 87, right, or something like that?
The last show I did with Donna was a 12-hour marathon. It was December 17th, 1987, and we're on the front page of the New York Times the next day, December 18th, 1987.
Well, so when you talk about, breaking bands, and like you made a point, there's a long list. How does, this station in Long Island, New York, go about finding bands that ultimately become of what we think of like, the second British invasion and beyond?
So we had sources, yeah. So the 2 big importers we used was Dutch East India and Rockville Center, New York. Dennis flew to London to do the deal with Rough Trade. So Rough Trade as a label, Rough Trade as a record store, they would get in all the imports in. And what the deal was every Thursday they would ship us 1 box of new releases. Some of them were signed, some were not signed, some were just test pressings. And that box would go Heathrow to JFK. My staff, as the music director, my staff would meet the plane, get the box, bring it to me. I'd bring it home Thursday night, and that was the beginning of weeding it through. So between the Dutch East box and then the record labels themselves on what they had, some things that were alternative, some things that were meant for college radio stations here in this country domestically. But then Rough Trade became a real finding that golden nugget, the needle in the haystack, so to speak, musically. That's where we found it, between those 3 sources.
Wow. I'm getting goosebumps just thinking about this. It's so exciting too. I think about my experience in the 80s, just, talking to the the kids that worked at the record store. They oftentimes had someone who was spinning records at a record store, just trying to find out what was new and hot. You had it before that. We're
Yeah, I
looking
mean,
through
a
crates in a
week ago,
store.
I
You
did
got
a panel discussion with Dennis and Max and Donna, and I actually brought the physical vinyl that I had in those boxes that I saved. For example, I brought with me, there was just a test pressing, wasn't signed, a black magic marker on a white label. It was vinyl, and it said MARRS, and it was Pump Up the Volume.
more, of course.
So I
Of
brought
course.
that with me. I put them on easels so people could understand what we were looking at and physically what we saw. Ironically, it was record store day. And it was Earth Day that day too. So it just happened to all kind of fall together on this panel discussion that we did. But it was interesting to kind of break down how we got there. Now, a song like Pump Up the Volume, I realized immediately it was a hit. I called Dennis Friday. I said, holy shit, we have something here. And I said, let me test it. So I would normally test things on Sunday night. So the import show from the box would be off the boat. And that would give me at least 2.5 days to go through all the vinyl to make sure that I had the right nuggets for a 1-hour show every Sunday night. I said, I'm spinning at the Malibu, which was a nightclub on Long Island, held about 2,000 people. And I spun it for the dance floor. Now, you got to realize I'm live on the air, and there's no delay, and I'm live in the club. No bathroom break, 5 hours, 9 p.m. to 2 a.m. I played this like it's like doing a focus group, and the place went nuts. So I played it off the boat the next night. And then Dennis and I basically put it on the air in rotation. We added it. What we would used to do is we just put it in the new music bin, and it was up to the jocks to play it or not play it. They had freedom of choice. There was no playlist. So we started playing it on Monday morning, like constantly. When I say constantly, we would never repeat anything within 3 hours or so. But we had to drop the call letters into the middle of the song because there were radio stations that knew about this song. It went viral, and they were trying to copy it off the air. Now, it's illegal to rebroadcast someone else's signal, but they would still try to do it. So you drop the call letters in the song so that if they tried to or even attempt to, the LIR call letters would be buried in the song. So that was our little trick on trying to keep it to ourselves.
A good one for it too, because there's so much happening constantly that if they were to try to edit that out, it would probably, it would be recognizable by folks familiar with it from listening on LIR. So, like you mentioned, you worked at Malibu, and I know you worked at some other clubs too, and you're able to test at least, pump up the volume there. But I don't imagine you had that luxury as often. What else? How did you identify what you thought might be a hit?
There are times that I thought a song would not be a dance hit, would be a dance hit, like Violent Femmes, Blister in the Sun. There's something about that song that when you put on that, like, the focus group is if they're starting to see people walk away from the dance floor, and you got a little bit of an issue there, right? There were certain songs you kept in your back pocket. That worked. Obviously, Just Can't Get Enough by Depeche Mode. That would work. For some reason, Sanctuary by the Cult just made the people go, wow, and they just danced to it. Now, there was a dance mix of it, too. But there were certain little gems that it didn't matter if it seemed like it was an obvious dance hit, because Blister in the Sun, to me, is not an obvious dance hit. But in speaking to Gordon Gano about it, he didn't realize that the song would take off in that direction the way it did. So it was things like that I would test. Now, there were other things that I would test that I would think, well, was it a hit or not a hit? And maybe I'd react in the club. Or if it wasn't meant for the club, maybe on Off the Boat on Sunday night. So one example would be, I always love this song, the Scottish band, The Blue Nile, a song called Tinseltown the Rain. I would play that, and the people in the club would come up to me and say, that's cool. Now, is that something maybe early on in the dance evening, you would play it and people would start to get in the groove. But then if I played it off the boat, it was meant more for the masses, right? Because the club was one thing, what you're doing on the radio is meant for more of a wider spectrum of audience.
Sure. Right. Yeah. So you mentioned that the DJ didn't have a playlist, but my understanding is that, your role, at least, in addition to being an on-air, as you mentioned, was your music director for the better part of the 1980s. What's the role of a music director if not to create, in other places we understand music directors, program directors are putting these lists together, and you've got to stick to the list. And what is the role at LIR though in that regard?
So the model is this. Dennis is the program director, right? So Dennis hires the air talent. Dennis has the final say. The music director is number 2 to the program director. So what the music director has to do, he has to be the human filter. And he has to deal with the record labels, which is a whole different story because they have a marketing strategy. And they want you to play a certain song at a certain time and not jump ahead to the next single or what they perceive to be the next single. We were like, screw the rules.
Mm.
There are no rules. It's our radio station. We program it the way we do. Now, what we did do was we actually would have music. We'd have weekly meetings with every DJ, and we'd go through everything that we thought was really cool. So it became like a 2-hour listening session of what we liked, what we didn't like. Now, Dennis and I would do our own meeting first to say, yeah, no, maybe. Let's see what they say, right? So Dennis and I would meet first. Then that was on Monday. Then on Tuesday, we'd bring the staff together, and then we'd start to listen to songs together. And we usually met at someone's house or my apartment or wherever it was. And we kind of took turns a little bit with that. So we had a lot of great interaction. Unfortunately, someone had to be on the air. So we try to alternate the time so that we try to get everybody involved. So it was inclusion, but the music director and the program director basically have the last, I had the next last to say, Dennis had the last say.
Mm-hmm.
And then whatever we added that we thought was deemed to be on the air, they could mix in, I mean, the idea was to play as much new music as possible, but also to back it up with songs that, we felt were relevant. Like, for example, a song like Foxhole from Television it came out in 1978, but this is 1981. So we kind of dip back a little bit in the past. We kind of mix it in. Also, the joy of being a DJ is the art of the segue, right? Having songs that flow into each other. Maybe the way one song ends and the other song begins is like a flavor to itself. It was just pure creativity with no rules. And then we drop in movie drop-ins, or, for example, like the Screamer of the Week. Sometimes I actually sat behind Tom Hanks at the Emmys one year. And I said, Tom, that laugh in the money pit when the bathtub falls through the ceiling and you just lose it with that laugh. I said, we used to play that on the air. It's probably the greatest laugh of all time. He goes to me, I wish I made money on that laugh. I remember that laugh. It was really fun to do that laugh. I mean, so he got into this conversation with me, but it's stuff like that. And I had to try to explain to him what we were doing with the laugh. So it really became thematic in many ways.
Right. So you mentioned the Screamer of the Week. So this is where the actual listeners get to vote on what they believe is the top new song of the week, right?
Right. We all had a pick. Every DJ had their own pick, and we'd all when we're on the air, we'd be charging with, this is why this should be the best new song of the week. And then when it wasn't our shift, we actually had little recordings from ourselves that we rotated through everybody's show, that when, let's say it was the Replacements, I'll Be You, and it's Donna's pick, right? Before we play I'll Be You, we play a little clip from Donna that's 20 seconds long, like, vote for this song for Screamer of the Week. This is my pick, the Donna pick, or this is the Larry the Duck pick. And then we crown a champion every Thursday night at 10 o'clock. And the phones were fast and furious. There was no internet. It was just people calling in, and it was wild. And sometimes it went down to the last minute. Yeah.
Gosh, it's such a romantic time for me. So when you talk about calling in to radio stations, gosh, that was such a big part of, growing up in the 1980s, trying to be the 10th caller or voting on something like that. It was so exciting.
Well, there was no email. There was no internet. There was no social media. So the direct contact through the phone to the listener. And that was the fun part, where people would call in, they'd say something funny, or maybe they wouldn't. They'd say, screw that. You are dismissed. Hang up the phone, go to the next caller. And the technology was changing too, because for the radio stations, if they had dead spots in their signals, like, so for FM, you want two things. You want height and power. The higher you are, right, the further the horizon. But sometimes it'd be a hill that would block the signal. So they would get what was called translators, which actually they use today in mobile technology for couponing and department stores, right? They're like mini translators where it'll pick up your mobile device for couponing and things like that. So that was the early stages of that technology. And the translators would actually fill in the gaps of your signal that you couldn't reach. And when people joke about putting the aluminum around the antenna and standing on 1 foot, trying to reach out this way to get the signal, a lot of that is true.
Right. Yeah. You remind me of putting aluminum foil now on my rabbit ears.
Yeah, there you go.
The TV work in there. So, look, we like you mentioned, there's a long list of bands that you broke. Let's drop some names. Can we talk about some of it? And look, because in addition to being an on-air talent, you also did interviews with a number of different up-and-coming artists. Do you have a favorite interview you could share with us, or maybe a least favorite interview?
Well, so I say three things. One, I think in terms of bands that we broke, I mean, I think U2 is at the top of the pile, and I think that the band recognizes that. Look, they acknowledged this when they did the War Tour at the Nassau Coliseum. That clip is actually in the movie New Wave Dare to Be Different, we got off the soundboard. We had it on the air the next morning with Bono, saying LIR, and the fact that, if you remember, they played the Malibu in December of 1981. It was the last night of the October tour. I guess during the Innocence and Experience tour, I just happened to be up in the studios of Sirius XM, and we did a last-minute interview with U2. They agreed 2 hours before the interview. It was an off night at the Garden, and I spent time with all four of them, and they all remembered. They hugged me. Wow. They thanked me. I mean, I get goosebumps and tears in my eyes when I think about the hug Bono gave me, putting his arm around my neck and, just saying thank you. They don't forget. And Paul McGuinness didn't forget. He's in the movie. He's the manager of U2. So number one, I'd have to say, if I had to point to one band, there were too many to really name in this interview, but that was one, top of the pops, I guess. Least favorite interview, Frank Zappa. Frank Zappa, before we changed the format, and he was difficult. If he didn't like the question, it was no, right. No, yes. I mean, it was horrible. My favorite interview was actually non-musical. It was Jim Henson, the great Muppeteer, when the movie Labyrinth came out. And I have it on cassette, actually, because, remember a cassette?
Oh, yeah.
90 minutes I had him on the air. And the one reason I had him on the air was his daughter. So he's the oldest. He had 6 children. Heather was his youngest child, and they lived in Westchester, and she was a huge fan of LIR. And as Jim had a great relationship with David Bowie in Labyrinth, which is a very dark Muppet movie when you see it. She said to her dad, if you're going to do promotion for Labyrinth, you got to go on LIR. Got a call from Henson Productions saying Jim wants to come on the air. And I was like, is this a trick question? He showed up at 8 a.m. with Heather.
He came into the studio.
Mm-hmm. He drove from Westchester, came to beautiful downtown Hempstead, came up to the Penthouse, which we loosely called, and he spent 90 minutes with me in the studio. He did all the voices. He did Kermit, Animal, Cookie Monster. He talked about his relationship with Bowie. And I remember at the end of the interview, I said, Jim, what you created with a sock in 1959, because that's all a Muppet was a sock that evolved over time. I said, one day you and I will no longer be here, but the Muppets will live on forever. And sadly, 3 years later, he died of a rare illness at NYU Hospital with a heart ailment at the age of 51.